Good evening, everyone, our in-person and virtual audiences tonight. I'm Amy McDonald, the director of this joint. I'm so looking forward to this conversation, part of our Phenomenal Women series. Talk about breaking glass ceilings. Eileen McNamara started at the Boston Globe as a secretary, working her way up through the newsroom to become a columnist, for which she won the Pulitzer Prize for Commentary in 1997. She went on to win several more awards over the years and is now Professor Emerita of the journalism program at Brandeis University, and I'm glad to see some of her students are with us tonight. She also wrote the definitive, as she says, the one and only, biography of Eunice Kennedy Shriver, another woman I think we can say broke a few glass ceilings. Margaret Sullivan began her journalism career as an intern at the Buffalo News, moving up the ladder to become the first female editor. She then joined the New York Times in 2012, becoming the first woman to hold the position of public editor. In 2016, she left the Times to become media columnist for the Washington Post, writing her last column for the Post this past August. She is now the Egan Visiting Professor at Duke University. Her memoir, Newsroom Confidential, is also a commentary about the industry. It is lively, it is fun, it is insightful, it's a little scary. I encourage you to buy it. Our wonderful bookstore, Brookline Booksmith, is outselling it in the lobby, and Margaret will be signing copies after the conversation. And we also have a reception with wine and food, and I hope you will all stay around and meet these panelists after the conversation. Radio Boston host Tiziana Dearing is our own phenomenal moderator for the series. Take it away, Tiziana. Please welcome our panelists tonight.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening to the two of you.
Good evening.
Good evening.
So whatever shall we talk about?
There's not much to
I
say.
can't even imagine. It's really exciting to have you here for this Phenomenal Women series, which was crafted, and what we've done with it is really try to engage with women who are breaking ground, have broken ground, destroyed ground in professional fields, and kind of explored, well, how'd you get there? What did you learn from it? What's the path to lay forward? And then we have this fascinating additional layer with the two of you, which is specialists in an industry that is near and dear to our hearts in a moment that is particularly relevant. So I think it's going to be fun to weave all of that together. I'm going to start really in the phenomenal women space. And same question to each of you. Margaret, I'll go to you first. When is the first time you remember in your life defying expectations for a female?
Well, I think in high school, I really wanted to go to a big fancy college like my brothers were going to, in Massachusetts, actually, even though I was in Buffalo. And my parents, you know, I mean, they had the idea that girls were a little different and they didn't really need to go to MIT or Holy Cross or something like that. And they wanted me to keep me close to home. And I did go to Lemoyne College, which I have only good things to say about. It's a Jesuit school. But the whole time I was there, I was plotting to, you know, go someplace bigger in a bigger city. And I ended up at Georgetown. And I think I had to fight against my family's expectations and my mother's expectations, frankly, to show that, yeah, I could be just as treated the same way as my older brothers.
And did your mom eventually embrace it?
Well, they sent, you know, they paid the tuition, so I guess so. But, you know, I sometimes joke about this, that my mother, you know, my mother had a fabulous early career before she was married as a department store buyer. She was a buyer for better dresses, which always made me wonder what the other dresses should be described as. But she quit when she got married, you know, and so there was always that tension, you know, what's a girl supposed to be like? What's a girl supposed to do and be? And I don't think that I got the answer from her. I had to figure that out on my own.
So Eileen, I'm going to give you a second longer to think about that, because I just want to let the audience know, if you have questions for Margaret and Eileen, you go to sli.do. So sli.do. You enter newsroom. That's kind of like the hashtag. And you can enter your questions there. So your turn, Eileen. First time you remember in your life defying expectations for a female.
Well, I'm not sure if it was because I was a female, but I guess we all start in high school. No one in my family had ever gone to college. So the expectation was that I wouldn't go either. And I never would have gone to college, as though I wanted to, if it weren't for a high school English teacher. I went to a little high school that no longer exists. It was called North Cambridge Catholic High School, and surprisingly, it was in North Cambridge. And it was a really small school, and some people did go to college. Lots of people went to BC Nursing School and to Regis, lots of Catholic colleges. But my father didn't think that that was a wise choice. So this English teacher, amazingly enough, she was only in Cambridge because her husband was getting his PhD in physics at Harvard. And so she took me under her wing. She only taught there for a year, but I became her babysitter. And when it came time to apply for colleges, she handed me the application to Barnard in New York, which, of course, I'd never been out of North Cambridge, so I didn't even know what it was or where it was. And she said, she gave me the $5 to fill out the application. And the funniest part of this story is I then went to the Sister Margaret Ann, who was the college counselor at North Cambridge Catholic, which wasn't a tough job, since not many people went to college, and asked her if she had a catalog for Columbia. And she asked me why I wanted to go to school in South America.
She was the college counselor. Wow.
I couldn't make that one up.
Oh my gosh.
So I guess that defied expectation.
And does she know? Does she know that she set you on a different path?
My English teacher?
Yeah.
Oh, Lord. She just turned 80, and I saw her last summer when she lives out in California, and my daughter is working in San Francisco. So this was the first time I had an opportunity to introduce my daughter, Katie, to her. She's heard about her whole life.
Yeah.
Because she clearly did change my life.
Margaret, in reading your book, you are a very determined woman. And
Little driven.
yeah, and you talk about that. Okay, so because you said that, we were going to go there later. We're going to go there right now. Because you talk about that, and it is very interesting the way that you lay out your determination as a woman, your sort of head down, straightforward, get to the job that I want to get. And also the challenges of that as a mother, as a wife, as a mother. You tell a story in the book that still makes a bead of sweat run down my back, which is trying to use a plastic breast pump in a conversation, in a day where you have meetings with Ben Bradley from the Washington Post, and just remembering from my own experiences with, a less friendly environment and trying to do that. I mean,
Yeah, that was very stressful. I was at the Buffalo News at the time, but visiting the Washington Post, and with basically a newborn baby staying with a friend in Northern Virginia, and I had to pump, and the only place there was to pump at the Washington Post, well, there really wasn't any place, so I just went into the ladies' room, into a stall, and it was actually really, it was a really long time ago. My son is a lawyer now. But I remember how completely stressed out I was and how literally impossible it was to do.
So I wanted to ask you, are you at peace with all of that?
Wow. Oh, with all of that? Well, I've had I've had a lot of success as a journalist. My drivenness has gotten me places, And I'm actually now at a time when I'm trying to change my life a little bit. I joked when I left my column at the Washington Post, which I could have done for forever, I guess, that it was like a self-imposed term limit, which I actually think columnists, it's a good idea to, Eileen and I were talking about this. After a while, you start writing the same column over and over. But now, I'm going to teach, I'm going to write some fiction, and I'm going to try to have a little bit more balanced and a little bit more relaxed life, and we'll see if I'm actually able to do that.
And in general, because you thought what I was asking you was, are you at peace in general?
Yeah, well, I think pretty much. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. How about the rest of you guys? I don't know.
So Eileen, I want to, we were talking in the green room beforehand. You have 3 kids. And this question of breaking ground as a woman in a time when women were expected to have children, expected to be home with the children, or if not at home with the children, just figure it out. How do you think about that time now? And are you at peace?
Well, I'm not at peace. I'll probably never be at peace because I think that there were trade-offs that we had to make at the time that we came into journalism, that I wish I hadn't had to make. I hope my son isn't here, because if he is, I don't want him to come up on the stage and tell you the compromises that they were. But I think it was very hard to do what we did in the culture of a newsroom, as it was when we were coming up, and have what anybody could think of as a kind of normal home life. You were always running, and it wasn't just deadlines. I took the work home. I didn't cover the Boston Ballet. I went to Columbine, and when a classroom full of 5th graders in Dunblane, Scotland were massacred, they sent me. So I think we think differently about journalism now and what reporters experience. I always went on those assignments because I felt like I could never say no. No matter how difficult it might be emotionally to do those, I always felt that the institution was looking for an excuse to say that women won't go, they won't travel, they won't do that difficult story.
If you said no once, it might not come around
It
again.
might not come around again. So I always said yes. But it meant that I covered a lot of really difficult things, and I tried to leave it in the newsroom, but I know that I didn't. So you bring, and there's no way that people talked about anything like trauma or the emotional
PTSD.
toll. Yeah, that it takes on you to cover those kinds of stories. But it does take a toll on you, and I think I brought a lot of that into my house.
I'm going to have you move your mic a little bit, just next time.
Okay.
Margaret, so I want to stay on this subject a little bit longer. So in my career, my first leadership role, my kids were 2 and 5. And later I would say to people, I was angry for about 10 years because I could never be as good at any of the things I was responsible for as I knew I could be if it was the only thing I was responsible for. When, in that time when you were being pulled in so many different directions, when do you think you were at your most phenomenal, your most magnificent?
Well, I remember a moment when I was being named editor of the Buffalo News, which was a job that I had sought. I was the first woman to do it. I kind of got the job against the odds. There was a strong internal candidate who was a guy who was the favored candidate of the previous editor. There was a lot sort of going against me, but I did get it. And it was being announced at an outdoor event that was, newspaper-wide. And I remember that my daughter Grace was really little. I mean, she was 5 or 6. And she came up on stage with me when I went to speak to the assembled group, which was not just journalists, but, the circulation people and the advertising people and all of that. And I remember she kind of, I have a photo of this, so maybe my memory is so affected by the photo, but she's kind of peeking out from behind my skirts a little bit, and she looks very curious and very confident, and I felt very lucky to have her there with me and to be maybe setting a good example for her and embracing this position that I had just gotten. And it got really tough after that, and it did take a toll. I mean, I am divorced, and I think that I put my children's well-being up pretty high. But it's hard to balance all that stuff. And my husband worked in the newsroom, so that added to it. So I think there were moments when I felt things were pretty glorious. But what there weren't were times when I said, well, I'm sure it would be wiser and better for me to just be a little more mellow. That just wasn't who I was.
So I'll stay with a follow-up for you, and then I'll go back to Eileen, because we have an audience member. You say you're driven, but that can be interpreted a number of ways in male-dominated industries. How was your ambition interpreted in the newsroom? That's the question from the audience member.
Well, I mean, and some people thought that it was unseemly, that it in fact, I remember an older woman reporter saying to someone else in the newsroom, she's about me, she's very ambitious. Like this was some sort of sin or something. And I guess so, but you don't really hear people say that about men, or you didn't hear people say it about men. It was just like, yeah, they want to be successful. It wasn't like the scarlet letter. So I don't know. I guess it was perceived both as a strength in some ways, and as something kind of weird and scary in other ways.
So Eileen, you made a lot of hay in column work. And I found myself thinking, for a long time, the worst thing to be was an opinionated woman. And you made your living as an opinionated woman. How was it breaking into that space? And sort of, if I were inside your head, what was the moment? Did you ever have a moment where you stopped apologizing for having opinions, or were you just ready from the beginning and there was no internal check?
Well, I've never apologized for anything.
Fantastic.
So no, I never apologized for having opinions. And I would say I spent 20 years at the Globe as a reporter before I became a columnist, which I think saved my life as an opinion writer. I went in with a lot of confidence as an opinion writer because I knew what I was talking about. I'd been a reporter. I started here covering the night police beat. I covered the State House. I covered Congress. I wasn't young and untried. So I think that helped a lot. But I used to keep this email that I got early on in my column writing career that came from a male reader who said that he had followed my reporting career at the Globe for those 20 years and admired my work. But he worried about me as an opinion columnist because he noticed that when I was at the State House, I wrote an awful lot about the Department of Social Services and not that much about administration and finance. So, I was really leaning a little bit too much toward those women's issues. And he hoped that as a columnist that I would, toughen up and write a little less about battered women and abused children. And not just domestic violence, but, juvenile crime and things that I was just sort of naturally attracted to write about. And my response to him, I think, stands up. I told him I'll write less about those things when my male colleagues start writing about them more. And I'm still waiting. So I think it's always been hard to be an opinionated woman in the world, not just in newsrooms. But without our voices, you cede the stage to people who didn't necessarily do all the best things with the stage when they had it exclusively to themselves.
Margaret, how did you change the stage? As you emerged into leadership in Buffalo, how did you change the stage? I love that analogy.
One thing I tried to do right away was to diversify the newsroom, because the newsroom that I inherited was about 3% non-white. And the city and the region were, much more diverse. So I started, this was, at a time when I could still hire, it was before the sort of crash in which we had to start doing buyouts and layoffs and everything. So I was able to hire aggressively. And what I changed was the prerequisites that a reporter or an editor had to have before we would consider them as a candidate. You didn't necessarily, in my mind, have to have 3 to 5 years at, in Binghamton or in Rochester or wherever it was, that I would look at people a little differently because I really, really wanted to change the makeup of the newsroom. And I don't mean that I lowered our standards. I just mean that I looked at people who had different kinds of backgrounds. And that was successful. And I'm very proud of having done that.
So when you say it was successful, clearly part of what you mean is you changed the diversity of the newsroom. Mm-hmm. How did it change the stories you told? How did it change the journalism, the reporting?
I mean, people always, reporters are not, we talk about objectivity, and there's a whole debate about whether that even exists, but reporters and writers and editors always bring their own experience to the table. And so when you have people who have lived, as people of color, they have a different experience and they come up with different story ideas just naturally. They don't necessarily set out to, cover the race beat or something, but they see the world differently, and so you get different kinds of stories.
Eileen, how would you rate the Globe on that?
How would I rate the Globe on diversity?
Yeah.
Well, we have a ways to go. I think every newsroom in the country has a ways to go. And I think we should broaden that conversation about diversity, too. I mean, I was at the Globe for 30 years, and we talked about it all the time, but I didn't see the needle moving a lot. Yes, we had more reporters of color, but we never had anything in proportion to the numbers in the city. Well, why is that? It isn't because there aren't people out there to take those jobs. And if that were true, that there weren't people, why don't we commit ourselves? Why didn't we commit ourselves 30 years ago to going into the Boston public schools and helping them set up newspapers, especially now with the internet where it's so easy, you don't have to print a physical newspaper, and teach them what journalism is and follow those kids. Follow them into college and bring them into the newsroom. I mean, all the big newspapers have internship programs. And it's wonderful. If you went to Princeton and Harvard, you'll be certain to get one of those internships. But I'd like to see the Boston Globe have its interns from Dorchester. Mm-hmm. And we should be invested in bringing kids along so that they're ready to come be interns at the Boston Globe.
So let's stay with the Globe because, the Globe's just announced this week. Nancy Barnes, who is currently the chief news executive at NPR, will be the new editor, replacing Brian McGrory, first woman in the role. So just to put it in perspective, 13th editor in 150 years, first woman in the role. So sort of going down the line, Margaret to Eileen first, just reactions to that appointment, Margaret.
Well, I know Nancy Barnes, and she has a great background in newspapers. She'll be a good leader. She's very capable. She has the perfect background, I would say, for the job. And I would say that it's very refreshing and necessary to not have, only white men running such a powerful institution. So I applaud it. I think it's great.
And Eileen, first reactions?
I think it's great, and I think it's long overdue. Mm-hmm. And I think she'll be wonderful. But why did it take so long? There have been no women at the Boston Globe all these years. I mean, I was lucky to have a lot of mentors, older women at the Globe, who were phenomenal. There's going to be a new movie out next year about one of them, Loretta McLaughlin, who passed away not that long ago. And Loretta would be amused to find out that, a very famous, beautiful actress is playing her in this movie, because Loretta was one of the first reporters in Boston to make the link during the Boston Strangler killings that there was one serial killer that was killing these women in the city. Loretta could have been the editor of the Boston Globe. She became the editor of the editorial page, but she was initially passed over for that job for a brilliant young man. He was brilliant and tragically died very young. And a good friend of mine, and I admired his work so much. But I don't think you could find a woman who worked at the Boston Globe in that era who didn't think that Loretta was passed over for that job and shouldn't have been. I think it takes a long time, and I'm glad that this day has arrived. But I can't help but note that newspapers are in their decline. And so the Washington Post now has a woman editor, and the Boston Globe has a woman editor. And you'll remember when people stopped watching broadcast news, women got to be on the anchor desk. There's a pattern here. When I first went to Capitol Hill to cover Congress, just by coincidence, the new reporter for the Chicago Tribune, the LA Times, and Newsday, and the Boston Globe were all women. And as we set up our computers in the House Press Gallery, one of the congressional correspondents for the New York Times turned to us and said, well, there goes this beat. Now it's a pink ghetto. Oof. And he was a wonderful guy.
Does not sound like it, actually.
Whoa. Really? Because women have been assigned to this beat, it is suddenly devalued. I think we're seeing a little of that. And I wish her well, and she'll do a great job, I'm sure. She's got an incredible resume at the Boston Globe. But it's been a long time coming.
Let's do another audience question here. What are the most substantial, hard-to-see barriers that existed for women journalists when you both got started, and what about today? So then and now, Margaret.
Well, I think in my era, there was sort of a feeling that women should be covering certain kinds of beats or work in particular departments. So when I got my first big management job, it was unsurprisingly, I mean, I had been on the city desk, which was, hard news. But when I was named an assistant managing editor, which is a step up the ladder, I was in the features department. The features department is like the softer part of the paper. It's the features. It's what used to be the women's section. So, it was difficult for me to come out of this role in the features department and become managing editor of the paper, because it was kind of like, well, has she really done the serious work that, if I had been the city editor, if I had been the national editor, whatever it was. So there's kind of that piece of it. I mean, right now, I don't think there are huge barriers. I mean, I think there are pay equity issues. I know there are at many news organizations, that women and people of color and women of color are just not paid as much, and it's documented. So that's still there, but I'm not sure about the, I think in general you can move up in the organization more easily.
Although I do wonder, are we still missing the networks of mentors, the people who bring you up behind them, the role models that show you what you can imagine, especially for journalists of color in the news industry? Have we gotten there yet?
Well, it's happening, but it's slow. And, for the longest time, you'd hear about the pipeline. Well, there's women and there's people of color, and they're going to be great when they run the paper, and they're in the pipeline right now, but the pipeline seemed to be very long and never ending.
Kind of to your point.
Yeah, kind of.
So same audience question to you, the hardest barriers that you faced when you broke into the field, and what do you perceive those to be now?
Well, I think the culture at large has changed a lot since we started in journalism. It's not just newsrooms. I mean, it's most institutions, I think, were challenging when you began. There are things that editors said to me along the way, and I'm sure to you, Margaret, that would never get said today. There were decisions made about who could cover what that would never be made today because of fear of lawsuits, if nothing else. I can remember when I was in the Washington Bureau, and Ted Kennedy was going to Ethiopia during the famine in 1984. That's how old I am. And I came home to Boston on the weekend. I was commuting back and forth, remarkable as that was, and learned that they were sending a reporter from Boston with the senator to Ethiopia. And I thought that was extraordinary. Since I covered him every day, why wasn't I going? And when I asked, the first response was that he was going over the Christmas holidays, and they thought I would want to be home with my husband, who was covering the Boston Celtics, who are probably playing out of town. So he didn't work for the Boston Globe at the time, so that didn't seem like a likely explanation. And then the answer was, well, this other fellow has already gotten a visa, and it was a communist country. You couldn't get in. You won't be able to get in. So, you have a choice at that moment. You can sort of accept the way things are, or you can decide to become a difficult woman. Mm-hmm. And I was a difficult woman at the Boston Globe. I don't think that there's anyone I ever worked for who would dispute that description. But I was difficult not because I'm not a nice person. I'm actually a really nice person. But I really don't like to get stepped on in that way. So I did what just seemed logical. I called the senator. I said, Senator, if I were to come off the plane with you, do you think the fact that I didn't have a visa would be an issue? And Senator Kennedy said, I do not think that will be an issue. And when we got off the plane, he said, Mac, where are you? And he put his arm through mine, and we walked through customs, and it wasn't a problem. And I did some pretty good work in Ethiopia, so I'm glad I got a chance to go. And I think ultimately the Globe was glad that I went.
So I'm feeling like if we had sort of the real-time work up here, we could just take the word phenomenal, we could replace it with difficult, right? And we could just continue with this series, Difficult Women. All right, so there's so much more that I want us to get to in this time. And I think I'm going to pivot now, Margaret, to some of the subjects in your book. And Eileen, I think you're familiar with the book.
I've read it, yes.
And I've read it. So we're all on the literal and figurative same page on that. Okay. So let's play with that a little bit. Because as one observes in reading it, and as you have said in interviews, it is one part memoir and one part manifesto. Mm-hmm. And when I read you saying that in an interview, I thought, well, isn't that kind of your life? Right? One part living your life and one part manifesto as a woman journalist breaking barriers all along. Are you a living manifesto?
No, I really don't think of myself that way. But I mean, in recent years, I have really felt like the press, like journalists, needed to, do better. As Trump came along, I think that journalists made a lot of mistakes, that news organizations made a lot of mistakes. I was not happy to see the way it was going, and I used my bully pulpit that I had both at the New York Times and the Washington Post to try to call journalists to their best work. And if that means I'm a living manifesto, I guess I'll embrace that. But I mean, I just think that as a media critic, which I was in a sense at the New York Times and certainly was at the Post, I tried to use my column for good, and to try to use it to improve things. And so I chose to do pieces that weren't necessarily going to be the most clickbaity things, but might be the most public-spirited things. But, I mean, I always want my work to be read. And so I never allowed it to be boring, but I didn't go after subjects because they were the hot thing at that moment, driven by celebrity or something like that. So, I do have some core beliefs that I've tried to, live through my work.
So one of the things that you talk about famously already, and the book just came out in October, is this question of traditional objectivity.
Right.
And at one point in the closing arc of the book, you ask, is traditional objectivity in need of an update? And I would argue that you argue that it is.
Yes.
You go on, and this is interesting because you both know Marty Barron. In fact, you were talking about him in the green room, former editor of the Boston Globe, former editor of the Washington Post. You go on to paraphrase him, quote, "It's not about false equivalency. It's about approaching every subject with an open mind, rigorously reporting without bias, and then telling the truth as gleaned in a straightforward manner," unquote. And at one level, as a journalist, I connected with that. And then at another level, I thought, well, that's always been what it's about. So what is this gnarly thing sitting in the middle of that? Because yes, find the truth, tell the truth, that is different, that needs this rehaul.
Right. I think people have gotten kind of hung up on the word objectivity. There's a generation now that says, well, maybe, but whose objectivity is it? What values are you bringing it? What framing are you bringing when you say that we're just approaching it neutrally? Isn't that an old school way of looking at things? I actually think Marty is correct that if you approach a story, a subject with an open mind and go after the evidence, that's really what we want to ask of journalists. I think that getting kind of down in the weeds with the word objectivity and whether it still has value now or not is a little pointless. And so I like to sort of pivot on that a little bit and say, use words like fairness, accuracy, evidence, facts, so that we're not arguing about this word when we really all want the same thing.
Eileen, you nodded a lot there.
Yeah. I mean, I'm so tired of this conversation about objectivity because I think it's about professionalism. And I do think there is such a thing as professional conduct as a journalist. I mean, we expect judges to be impartial. I mean, we don't think that they're sitting up there not having an opinion about what's unfolding in front of them. But their professional ethics require that they hold that in abeyance, that the jury is going to have the ultimate say here. And I think well-trained journalists go out with an empty notebook, and they fill that notebook with what they find in the world. They don't come out with a notebook that's already half filled with their preconceptions. It is possible to leave those at the door. It doesn't mean that you don't have them. It just means that you've trained yourself to be open-minded, to listen, to be fair. I know it sounds like an impossible task, and sometimes it is. And one of the wonderful things about being a journalist in the era that we came up in, where there were layers of editors to save you from yourself. If your opinion did find its way, there was an editor to take it out and to instruct you about why that paragraph didn't belong there. I think young people have a very different notion because they are very motivated as advocates. And one of the great challenges I've had in teaching journalism is to try to make the distinction between what we do and what advocates do. We don't have the power to change anything. I mean, journalists need to have some humility. What we do is we go out there and we tell you what the world looks like to us, which is why it's so important that we have a diverse newsroom of reporters going out into the world. If we find injustice, if we find wrongdoing, it's not within our power to fix it. It's within your power to see that it gets fixed because you're the electorate. And you can put pressure on people to fix things. And the pressure that we bring is a factual pressure. Look what we have found. Now it's out of our court. And I think young people want journalism to be the whole ball of wax. And I think when we try to do that, we're opening ourselves up to this notion that we're partisan and that we have an agenda. I don't have an agenda. My agenda is to find out what the hell's going on out there.
Is it just young people? I mean, haven't there been journalists with that advocacy bent always?
I mean, I'd just like to introduce one other element here, which I think is important, which is that if we define objectivity, and Marty doesn't, and I don't think Eileen is defining it this way either, but if we define objectivity as this sort of old school idea of, well, we're going to take everything down the middle and we're going to equate things, and our idea of fairness is to give equal weight to the two sides, whether they should be equal or not. That is an idea that needs to go away.
That
And
idea,
that's-
I think, has gone away.
Well, I'm not so sure it has.
I think the idea of nobody is equating vaccine deniers with vaccine scientists anymore. It's not that that's not out there. It's not that climate deniers aren't out there. But I don't think that journalists are doing it anymore.
Well, I think there's a lot of false equivalency still out there, and I think we see it when you turn on cable TV, for example, and see election deniers given lots of time and space to talk. That's a kind of way that that's happening. So, I mean, I think this is all part of the bigger debate about that kind of comes under the umbrella of objectivity. Maybe the word is a little bit off, but I'm very much opposed to the idea of false equivalence and a kind of both sidesing of truth and non-truth.
So there's an audience question here, and I'm going to take the audience question and then add to it to turn to the two of you. And I appreciate the debate between you because I feel like you're reflecting the moment that we're in and the tensions that we're experiencing in a field. So the question from the audience member is, how can journalists do their jobs as truth tellers in a world where lies are becoming mainstream? I want to blow that up a little bit into, let's call it, my phrase, not yours, the fog of war of 2015 to 2022. And the constantly changing in the environment, the pushing of norms, the changing and understanding of in what environments are people participating in good faith, not participating in good faith, and kind of that. I grew up in an area where there are a lot of farms. Have you ever seen a cat get scared and be on a screen, right? And all sort of the cat on the screen trying to hold on to and respond in those 7 years. What most went wrong? And what do we most need to fix or have fixed? And I'd love to hear from both of you. Margaret, why don't you start?
Well, I think one of the things that went very wrong was we had this candidate and then president, Donald Trump, who was not normal in any, or in hardly any way was he normal. And yet there was a tendency on the part of politics reporters to want to try to normalize him and to not be able to communicate just how damaging and just how many lies. I mean, there was even a long period of time when the word lie was sort of verboten.
You talk about that in the book.
Wouldn't use the word lie, wouldn't use the word racist, because we don't do that. And how can we really know if that's a lie, since that means it's intentional? Well, I think after the 5th or 6th or 10th time, we pretty much know it's intentional. So I think that the inability to really portray Trump and his allies and the media around it as weird and damaging as it was a failure.
Do you agree?
Yeah, maybe not as strongly. I mean, I think that there's a lot of things going on in the culture at the same time. There was a disinformation campaign in all those years that you were talking about, in the run-up to Trump, before Trump, after Trump, now. We have social media mega corporations that are making a fortune peddling racist material, peddling white supremacy, peddling lies about the election. At a certain point, we have to be grown-ups and say, everyone loves their Facebook page, but there's a place for government regulation here. And don't get distracted by the conversations about the First Amendment. We have to be able to say everything. We used to have a fairness doctrine in this country when it only applied to broadcast journalism, admittedly, and the internet is a much, much bigger challenge. But I think Donald Trump came along at a time when he was able to exploit the corporatization of information and of misinformation. And don't forget, there's foreign actors playing a part in all of this as well. And I agree with Margaret that, why is Marjorie Taylor Greene on the PBS NewsHour? I mean, why? I mean, under no rational thought can I understand why a respectable news organization would give her a platform. Well, she represents a certain kind of thought in the country, and she was elected. Well, good. Let her constituents' media cover her.
Would there have been a way to have her on air that didn't give her a platform?
No, because that's the whole point. You have to make tough decisions in journalism. Marjorie Taylor Greene isn't coming on to have a rational conversation about the issues. People like her are not trying to govern. They're not running for public office to govern. They're running to disrupt. And they've been very successful at it. And we've been complicit in giving them a microphone.
Yeah, I agree with that.
We have an audience question here. I'm going to hold that one, actually, for a little while. I want to come to this space. So difficult women, right, is our theme tonight. And I want to come back to the women's space. Always mindful, by the way, that women of our generation are having one conversation about womanhood coming up through industries in womanhood. And we are in a very, very different place now in how we think about womanhood, gender identification, what men and women and people who identify as non-binary can't do, don't do. And I think it's important to mark that. But the conversation that we're having here is on your experiences, your lived experiences, and the time that you came up. And one of the things that is interesting in this social media space, which, by the way, let's not forget, right? Private companies aren't beholden to the First Amendment the same way, a regulated or government entity is. The level of attack on women journalists, the trolling, the doxing, the hounding, the hunting, the threatening, so often on Radio Boston, when I say this new hate, guests will always say, no. There's nothing new about the hate. There's just something new about the channel, right? And so let me check that with the two of you.
Well, I mean, I experienced it very directly. As I was writing columns that had nothing to do with gender or being a woman, I would be attacked on social media, but also, through phone calls, email, even in person, in a very sexualized, a very gender-driven way. It would be about my body parts. And again, the subject matter had nothing to do with it. And, that does get to you after a while. I found it very debilitating, and I didn't have the worst of it by any means. I mean, there are many, especially reporters, women reporters who cover tech, just get hammered and get doxxed and have their lives ruined and their families' lives ruined.
So doxed is having their private information, their contact information, et cetera, made public.
Right.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So I mean, it's a very real thing, and it's also a part of what is so draining, and so it can really knock you out. It's been a really tough time.
Eileen.
Well, I'm glad I'm not writing the column anymore in the Globe, because it was hard enough when it was email. There was a guy who used to call the Howie Carr show all the time on the radio, Jerry in the Car. And Jerry in the Car didn't like me very much, and neither did Howie, actually. I mean, my point of view about things. So I would hear Jerry in the Car, and then I would get a voicemail from Jerry in the Car. And they were all violent. They were all like rape threats. Mm-hmm. And I didn't get really, really nervous about it until it started to become a pattern. And this was, there was a time when shock radio was a really big deal in Boston. It's not anymore, but it was. And there was another particularly vile shock jock in town who's no longer alive. May he not rest in peace. And he would name women journalists, especially women columnists. It would name us. And then these calls would come in all the time. And there was one guy that really scared me because he made reference in one phone call, he called repeatedly, to my mother's home address. Mm. The Globe called the state police. But I can't even imagine what it is like in the era of Twitter to be writing a political column. It's just got to be horrific. And this doesn't happen to men in the same way. It just doesn't.
Margaret, one of the things that you pointed out in your book, you talked about the change when then candidate Trump went out on the campaign trail. You talked about, for example, him calling out Katie Tur in I always think of it as the pit, right?
Right.
The area for journalists. And has been this real turning on journalism.
Yeah.
And there is the trust dimension to that, and then there's the humanity dimension to that. Are we beginning to recover? And if not, I'm hesitating because the things that I just called out, I'm not like blaming the victim, right? It's not Katie Tur's fault.
No.
But what do we need to do differently to continue to recover?
Yeah, I think one thing is that I don't believe that most newsroom leaders have a clue what it's like to be the people who are getting attacked. Like, they can understand it in an abstract way, but they don't know what it feels like. And it's pretty bad. So I worry about that. I think it's really tough for them to truly grasp what they're asking their people, the world they're asking their people to sort of live in. One of the things Trump said, and he said this to Leslie Stahl of CBS, is the reason I disparage you people, meaning journalists, is so when you write a bad story about me, no one will believe it. I mean, he master of saying the quiet part out loud, right? But that's a lot of what the disparagement of the press was all about. Make them look bad so that they're, it cuts into credibility. So all of this stuff, the disparagement, the harassment, the online stuff, it's all very discouraging, and it makes it hard to do the job.
So, you just talked about Leslie Stahl at CBS, Katie Tur, correspondent at NBC News. We do see a rising crop of more and more women out front in reporting, in journalism. And it takes me to another space that I want to talk about for just a minute. And I want to talk about white women. And here's a piece of what's on my mind with that. So this week, Nancy Barnes is named as the first woman editor of the Boston Globe. Maura Healey, who is white, is about to become the first first elected female governor, and first out lesbian governor here in Massachusetts. We have 5 of our 6 statewide offices being held by women, most of them white. So we are in a moment where white women in particular are enfranchised and gaining power in very specific ways. You as a white woman breaking glass ceilings in news. We still, to some extent, have an old narrative that is white women have been oppressed, white women are fragile, right? Or white women have been stuck at home. And all of that has been true, but there is a new power for white women now. And criticism and feminism. In newsrooms, that white women aren't using that power to bring up all women. As white women who are powerful, how do you think about that?
Well, I think one of the things that's happened is that as news organizations have felt the pressure to diversify their ranks at the top, a relatively easy way to address that is to finally give a top role to a white woman. There are lots of them that are at that secondary level. It's, there's a comfort level. I think it's more challenging to have a leader who's a person of color or, someone who is the other in some other way. So, I'm glad to see the walls breaking down for white women, and I think it needs to spread and be different.
Eileen?
Yeah, it's great that women are getting elected to statewide office in Massachusetts, because God knows it's new. And a lot of those women are women of color. I mean, we have a black attorney general, and that's a good thing. And we have black women in our congressional delegation. We have an Asian woman who's the mayor of Boston. I mean, things are changing. They're changing really slowly, but they're changing. And I think you're going to see the same phenomenon. It's the pipeline that Margaret talked about. The pipeline seems to take forever to spit people out, into positions of power. But I think it's happening. If you told me 10 years ago that we would have a landscape like this in Massachusetts, I would have laughed at you, because we are a really slow culture to change and to share power. We are.
All right. One of the funniest moments in your career as a woman journalist. Whoever thinks of theirs first gets to go first.
Funniest. Well, I tell a story in my book about being at the New York Times and having a disagreement with Dean Baquet, who was the top editor of the New York Times. And he had misunderstood what I said I was going to write in a blog post. And when he gave me a response, and it was just a misunderstanding. We got our signals crossed, and when he saw it, he got angry, and he expressed his anger to me. And I pushed back and said, no, you really can't talk to me that way. And he backed down, and soon showed up in my office with one of his deputies, looking kind of chagrined and sorry that he had popped off. And he said to me in a moment that I can't forget, "Can you hug the public editor?" And now, there was nothing Me Too-ish about this, believe me. It was not that kind of thing. But it was a really weird line to hear. And I just sort of shrugged and said, don't worry about it, Dean. Everything's cool. And but it was a moment, and it was definitely a memorable moment.
And it turns out you cannot hug
No,
the public editor.
No.
No.
How about for you, Eileen? One that just cracks you up.
Well, because rage is sort of my go-to emotion. This is really funny in retrospect, but when I went to the Washington Bureau, I didn't have an office. Everybody else had an office, and all the other reporters. And there was a young man in one of the offices. They had a door and everything, and he was a correspondent for the paper. He wasn't on staff. So I said to the bureau chief, well, do you think we could ask him maybe to sit in the hall here where you've put a desk for me? Because I'm having this experience that's happening every day, which is when the FedEx man comes, who do you think he goes to? And I said, he's a very nice man, but I don't want to keep signing for FedEx envelopes. So maybe you could ask the correspondent to sit out here, because I bet he won't come to him to get him to sign for these packages. I said, oh, no, we couldn't possibly do that. We couldn't possibly do that. And, he's been with us for a really long time. And I said, so you're going to leave me in the hall. And I covered the Hill. So I had a desk in the House Press Gallery, in the Senate Press Gallery, so I didn't have to be in the office. But it started to really bug me. So after a while, I did go in and complain about it again. And the next thing I knew, they were building a wall around my desk. And my bureau chief came in and said, we're even going to give you a door. Are you happy? Have you pulled yourself up by your pantyhose? Wow. And I thought, see, I said it wasn't completely funny. And I did wear pantyhose back then. But that's the kind of thing that wouldn't happen now. You wouldn't tell the only female news reporter in the Washington Bureau to pull herself up by her pantyhose.
Although the walling you in thing is a little bit funny.
The wall
actually
is pretty funny. It is pretty funny.
So we have an audience question that sort of channels the direction that one should go with the last question. So let's look at this one. What one piece of advice do you have for young journalists who are trying to break into the world of media, namely female journalists? And I know we have a number of young people here in the room tonight. So Eileen, I'll mix it up. I'll start with you this time.
Just be persistent. There's really no substitute for hard work. And there's just no substitute for believing in yourself. And there'll be lots of times where people will try to erode that confidence. And none of us are really that confident. I think most female journalists I know have this really tough persona, but they're kind of mushy in the middle because it takes just a lot of energy to have that persona. Just work really hard. And if it means that you have to work harder than everybody else, it sucks, but so what? Work harder than everybody else, and you'll get there. When I was answering Bob Phelps's office, good morning, Robert Phelps' office, may I help you? In the Globe newsroom, I never for a minute thought I was going to stay in that chair. And I think the conviction that I was not going to stay in that chair got me out of that chair.
Mm-hmm. Margaret.
I would say to get great reporting experience, that there is no substitute for covering a beat, putting yourself in a position where you're doing the basics of journalism. Like, don't come out of J school or start your career thinking that you're going to be an opinion writer or an essayist or something. Do the work of being a reporter. And as Eileen said, those years she had as a reporter served her so well when she did get to be a columnist. I think that everybody who is going to have a great career in journalism needs to have that foundation. So go get it at the beginning.
Well, you are truly phenomenal women, and I want to thank you for the conversation tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm always only supposed to give one shout out, but I'm going to give you two. Tomorrow night, if you're available, the next in our Phenomenal Woman series, Tiziana is back on the stage to interview Ayodele Casal. She is tap dancer extraordinaire, the choreographer recently of Funny Girl on New York City, Radcliffe Fellow. She's going to perform. She's phenomenal. It's worth coming. And next Monday, we have Bill McKibben here being interviewed by Miriam Wasser, our environmental reporter. But now, please go to the lobby, buy this unbelievably wonderful book. Margaret will be signing, and we have cheese and crackers and wine. So please come out and meet our panelists. Thank you, Tiziana, Margaret, and Eileen.